The summer breeze carried the sweet scent of roses through the garden as guests gathered for what was supposed to be the perfect wedding at the Golden Valley Resort. The bride, dressed in a stunning white gown with delicate lace details, stood before the mirror in her preparation room, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her veil. Her best friend since childhood watched her with a mix of joy and unease, holding back a secret that had been eating away at her for weeks. Outside, the groom chatted with his friends, his confident smile masking the nervous energy that coursed through him. The wedding planner rushed about, directing the staff to perfect every detail of the elaborate decoration that transformed the garden into a fairy tale setting. Crystal chandeliers hung from the trees, their light dancing off the white roses that lined the aisle. Among the arriving guests was a young boy, no more than 12, clutching his mother's hand tightly. His small face carried an expression far too serious for someone his age, his eyes darting between the guests as if searching for someone. His mother, wearing a simple blue dress, kept checking her phone, her face growing increasingly anxious with each passing minute. The wedding coordinator announced that the ceremony would begin in 15 minutes, and guests started taking their seats in the white chairs arranged in neat rows. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the scene, and a string quartet began playing soft melodies that floated through the air. Everything seemed perfect, yet there was an undercurrent of tension that no one could quite place. The groom's mother noticed something was off. She had been watching her son all morning, seeing how he kept checking his phone and wiping sweat from his forehead despite the pleasant temperature. She had raised him alone, and mothers always know when something isn't right. But she remained silent, hoping her instincts were wrong. As the music shifted to signal the start of the ceremony, the bride's father linked arms with his daughter, ready to walk her down the aisle. The guests rose from their seats, turning to watch the bride's entrance. The groom stood at the altar, adjusting his tie one last time, his best man patting his shoulder reassuringly. Nobody noticed the young boy slipping away from his mother's grasp, moving purposefully toward the front of the gathering. His small hands were clenched into fists, and his jaw was set with determination. His mother finally realized he was gone and began scanning the crowd frantically, her heart racing as she spotted him making his way toward the altar. The wedding officiant cleared his throat, ready to begin the ceremony that would unite two families. The bride took her first step onto the rose-petal-covered aisle, her face glowing with happiness behind her veil. The photographer positioned himself to capture every moment of what should have been a perfect celebration of love. But fate had other plans for this wedding day. As the bride reached the halfway point down the aisle, the young boy finally found his voice. His small frame straightened, and in a clear, unwavering voice that seemed too powerful for his size, he shouted the words that would change everything: "Stop. He has a secret family." The music screeched to a halt. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the source of the interruption. Time seemed to freeze as the boy's words hung in the air, heavy with implications that no one was prepared to face. The perfect wedding was about to unravel in ways that none of the guests could have imagined, revealing secrets that had been carefully hidden for years. The silence that followed the boy's outburst was deafening. The bride stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The groom's face had drained of all color, and his eyes were fixed on the young boy who had just shattered the perfect facade of his wedding day. The boy's mother rushed forward, trying to reach her son, but he stood his ground. "Tell them the truth," he demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Tell them about my mom and my sister." The guests began murmuring, their heads turning between the boy and the groom like spectators at a tennis match. The bride's father, still holding his daughter's arm, was the first to break the shocked silence. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his protective instinct kicking in as he watched his daughter's world potentially crumbling before her eyes. The bride's best friend covered her mouth with her hands, tears forming in her eyes. She had suspected something was wrong but never imagined this scenario. The groom took a hesitant step forward, his legs seemingly moving against his will. I can explain," he stammered, but the words died in his throat as a woman in a navy blue dress stood up from the back rows. She was holding the hand of a small girl, no more than 6 years old, who shared the groom's distinctive green eyes. "No more lies," the woman said, her voice carrying across the garden. "Our children deserve better than this." The wedding guests gasped collectively, and someone dropped a champagne glass, the sound of shattering crystal punctuating the dramatic moment. The bride's knees buckled, and her father caught her before she could fall. Her white dress pooled around her like fallen snow as she sank into a nearby chair. Her makeup artist friend rushed to her side with a glass of water, while the bride stared unblinkingly at the man she thought she knew everything about. The groom's mother stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion and horror. "Son," she whispered, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "please tell me this isn't true." But her son's silence spoke volumes, and she watched as the carefully constructed image of her perfect son crumbled before her eyes. The boy who had started it all walked closer to the altar, his small shoulders squared with determination. "He visits us every other weekend," he announced, his voice growing stronger. "He tells everyone he's on business trips. He promised to tell the truth before the wedding, but he didn't. He lied to everyone." The wedding planner stood helplessly by the flower arch, her clipboard hanging limply at her side as she watched months of careful planning dissolve into chaos. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, and the musicians' instruments lay forgotten in their laps as they watched the drama unfold. The woman in navy blue made her way down the aisle, her daughter trailing behind her. The little girl looked around curiously, seemingly unaware of the tension she had walked into. "We've been waiting for you to do the right thing," the woman said to the groom, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. 3 years we've waited. 3 years of promises and secrets." As cameras flashed and guests whispered frantically among themselves, the bride finally found her voice. She stood up slowly, her white veil catching the late afternoon sun. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear what she would say to the man who had apparently lived a double life throughout their entire relationship. But what happened next would leave everyone even more shocked than they already were. The bride's next words would reveal that this story had layers of complexity that no one, not even the groom's secret family, could have anticipated. The bride took a deep breath, her hands smoothing down the front of her wedding dress with eerily calm movements. "I knew," she said, her voice carrying across the stunned garden. "I've known about them for the past year." Her words sent another wave of gasps through the crowd, and the groom's face shifted from guilt to utter confusion. The woman in the navy blue dress stepped back, her grip tightening on her daughter's hand. "What do you mean you knew?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The boy who had started it all looked between the adults, his brave facade beginning to crack as he realized the situation was more complicated than he had imagined. "I hired a private investigator," the bride continued, her voice growing stronger. "After the third business trip, that didn't quite add up. After the mysterious phone calls and the hidden text messages." She turned to face the guests, her veil catching the light. "But that's not even the whole story." The groom's mother sank into her chair, watching as layer after layer of secrets began to peel away. The wedding planner had given up all pretense of maintaining order and was now recording everything on her phone, knowing she was witnessing something extraordinary. "I was going to confront him," the bride said, gesturing toward the groom, who stood rooted to the spot. "But then I discovered something else. Something that made me understand why he was living this double life." She reached into a hidden pocket in her wedding dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The groom's face went from confused to horrified. "Don't," he whispered, but his plea was lost in the thick tension that blanketed the garden. The bride's father stepped forward, trying to stop whatever was about to happen, but his daughter gently pushed his hand away. 3 years ago," the bride continued, unfolding the paper with trembling fingers, "someone was blackmailing him. They threatened to destroy his business, his reputation, everything he'd built. The price for their silence was that he had to maintain a relationship with both families. They were playing some sick game, watching him try to keep two lives perfectly balanced. The woman in navy blue stumbled backward, her daughter now clinging to her leg. "That's impossible," she whispered, but doubt had begun to cloud her eyes. The boy looked up at his mother, tears finally breaking free and rolling down his cheeks. The bride held up the paper, which everyone could now see was a letter. The blackmailer made one crucial mistake. They used the same typing paper that my father's company manufactures, a very specific, custom watermark. A paper that only one other person at this wedding would have access to. The string quartet's first violinist dropped her bow with a clatter as all eyes began scanning the crowd, trying to guess who among them could have orchestrated such an elaborate scheme. The groom's best man shifted uncomfortably, and several guests began to edge away from their seats, as if afraid of being implicated. "And today," the bride said, her voice thick with emotion, "I was finally going to expose everything. Not just my fiancé's double life, but the person who forced him into it. The real villain in this story." She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto someone in the crowd who had begun to stand up, their chair scraping against the garden stones. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as the true architect of this tragedy prepared to reveal themselves. The guests held their collective breath, knowing that the next few moments would change everyone's lives forever. The truth that was about to emerge would prove far more shocking than anyone could have imagined, even the children who thought they were simply exposing their father's secret life. A tall figure rose from the middle row of chairs, and the bride's younger sister stepped into the aisle. Her bridesmaid's dress rustled softly as she moved, her face a mixture of defiance and fear. The bride's hand flew to her mouth, the letter dropping to the ground. "No," she whispered, "please tell me it's not you." The younger sister's laugh was hollow, echoing across the now silent garden. "You always had everything," she said, her voice carrying years of buried resentment. "The perfect grades, the successful business, Dad's constant approval. And then you found the perfect man too." She took another step forward, her heel clicking against the stone path. The bride's father looked between his daughters, his face ashen. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The wedding guests sat frozen, watching the family drama unfold before them like a live theater performance. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," the sister said, wringing her hands. "It started as a simple plan to make your life less perfect. I discovered his secret family by accident, during a business trip to the coast. I saw him with them at a restaurant." She glanced at the woman in navy blue and her children. "I took photos, gathered evidence, and then I realized I had the perfect weapon." The groom finally found his voice. "You threatened to expose everything to my investors, to the media. You said you'd destroy my company's reputation unless I kept up the charade." His hands were shaking as he loosened his bow tie. "You made me keep lying to everyone." The boy who had started it all stepped closer to his mother, understanding dawning on his young face. "Is that why Dad always seemed so sad when he visited? Because someone was forcing him?" His mother pulled him close, tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the full scope of the situation. The bride's sister continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "I made him maintain both relationships. I wanted you to eventually discover his double life and be devastated. I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose everything you care about." She turned to the gathered guests, some of whom were recording the scene on their phones. "But then you hired that investigator, and I knew I had to push up my timeline." "So you told his son about the wedding," the bride said, realization dawning on her face. "You made sure he would be here today to expose everything publicly." The young boy looked up, shocked to learn he had been just another pawn in this elaborate game. The groom's mother stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "You played with children's lives, with all our lives, because of jealousy?" The little girl, still clinging to her mother's hand, began to cry, finally sensing the gravity of the situation. The wedding planner tried to usher some of the guests away, but nobody moved. They were all too entranced by the unfolding drama. The sister's next words froze everyone in place. "That's not even the worst part of what I've done." She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope, this one thick with documents. "I didn't just blackmail him," she said, her voice quivering. "I've been embezzling money from Dad's company to finance my own secret life. And Big Sister here," she gestured to the bride, "was getting too close to discovering that too." The bride's father staggered backward, reaching for support as the full impact of his younger daughter's betrayal hit him. The bride, still in her white dress, looked at her sister with a mixture of pity and horror. But before anyone could react further, a new voice cut through the tension. "I think," said someone from the back of the garden, "that's quite enough." All heads turned to see a figure emerging from behind the flower-covered archway, holding something that would turn this already shocking wedding into something none of them could have prepared for. Through the archway walked an elderly man in a well-worn suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. In his hands, he held a leather briefcase that looked as old as he was. The bride's father straightened immediately, his face showing recognition. "Uncle Robert," he gasped. "But you're supposed to be in Switzerland." Uncle Robert's weathered face held a grim expression as he made his way down the aisle. "I've been tracking the money," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority from his 40 years as a forensic accountant. "All of it. Every single transaction." He placed his briefcase on a nearby table, the sound of its latches clicking open cutting through the tense atmosphere. The bride's sister took an involuntary step backward, her confidence wavering. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier defiance. The woman in navy blue and her children watched intently, realizing they were about to witness yet another layer of this complex drama unfold. 3 years ago, Uncle Robert continued, pulling out a stack of documents, "I noticed discrepancies in the company's international accounts. Money was being moved through shell companies, through fake investments, through charitable donations that never reached their destinations." He looked directly at the younger sister. "But you made one crucial mistake." The groom moved closer to the bride, their personal drama temporarily forgotten in the face of this new revelation. The young boy who had started it all watched with wide eyes, understanding that his outburst had triggered something much bigger than he had imagined. "You see," Uncle Robert continued, laying out documents on the table, "every transaction, every fake company, every wire transfer, they all had one thing in common. They were all processed on the 23rd of each month." He looked up at the gathered crowd. "The same day your mother died, 15 years ago." The bride's father sank into a chair, his face pale. "The day we lost her," he whispered. The bride reached for her father's hand, while her sister stood frozen, color draining from her face. "It was your way of remembering her, wasn't it?" Uncle Robert asked, his voice softening slightly. "She always said the 23rd was her lucky number. But she never knew about the gambling addiction, did she? The debts you've been accumulating since college?" Gasps rippled through the crowd as the sister's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The wedding planner had long since stopped pretending to maintain order and was openly recording everything on her phone, along with half the guests. "The blackmail wasn't just about ruining your sister's life," Uncle Robert said, pulling out one final document. "You needed money to cover your gambling debts. So you forced the groom to funnel company funds through his second family's accounts, making it look like legitimate business expenses." The woman in navy blue stepped forward, still holding her daughter's hand. "Is that why you insisted we maintain separate accounts?" she asked the groom. "Why you were so specific about which banks we used?" Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The sister's eyes darted toward the garden exit, but Uncle Robert's next words stopped her in her tracks. "But here's what you didn't know," he said, pulling out one last piece of paper from his briefcase. "Your mother left something behind. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about this family." The bride's father stood up slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "The letter," he breathed. "The one she told me never to open unless something went terribly wrong with our family." Uncle Robert nodded gravely, holding up an aged envelope sealed with wax, its contents about to rewrite everything they thought they knew about their past. Uncle Robert broke the wax seal with trembling fingers as everyone gathered closer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as he unfolded the yellowed paper. The bride's father stood beside him, his shoulders tense, while both sisters unconsciously moved closer together despite their conflict. "My dearest family," Uncle Robert began reading, his voice thick with emotion, "if you're reading this, then our family has reached a breaking point, just as I feared it might." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "What I'm about to reveal will be difficult to hear, but it's time you knew the truth about our family's wealth." The police sirens grew closer, but no one moved. The woman in navy blue pulled her children close, sensing they were about to witness something historic. The groom's mother had moved to stand beside her son, her hand resting protectively on his arm. "The company that my husband built," the letter continued, "was not created with his father's investment as everyone believed. It was built with money I inherited from my own secret past, money that came from a family I had to leave behind to protect everyone I loved." The bride's father's knees buckled, and a groomsman quickly brought him a chair. The younger sister's face had lost all color, her earlier defiance replaced by shock. The letter's words continued to flow through Uncle Robert's steady voice. "Before I married into this family, I was part of a witness protection program. My testimony helped bring down one of the largest financial fraud schemes in the country. The money I received as part of the settlement was meant to keep me safe, to give me a new life. But I knew that even with a new identity, they would never stop looking for me." The young boy who had started this whole chain of events whispered to his mother, just like in the movies. She shushed him gently, but there were tears in her eyes. The bride had sunk into a chair beside her father, her white dress pooling around her feet. "I used that money to help my new husband start his business, but I knew the truth would have to come out someday. The guilt of keeping this secret has weighed on me every day. But here's what you need to know now, there's more money, hidden away in accounts that only Uncle Robert knows about. Money that was meant to protect this family if my past ever caught up with us." The younger sister's legs gave out, and she sat heavily in a nearby chair. The revelation that her embezzlement and gambling had put at risk not just the company, but her mother's sacrifice and safety, seemed to crush her completely. "But my greatest fear," the letter went on, "was that my secrets would poison this family from within. That the weight of unspoken truths would turn loved ones against each other. If you're reading this, I fear that has already happened." Uncle Robert's voice grew stronger as he reached the final paragraphs. "The accounts I've hidden away aren't just filled with money. They contain evidence that could still be dangerous in the wrong hands. Evidence that could protect or destroy our family's legacy. Robert knows what to do with it. Trust him as I have trusted him all these years." The sound of police cars pulling up outside the garden became clear, but Uncle Robert raised his hand, silencing any thoughts of flight. The letter had one final revelation, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their mother's death 15 years ago. "And finally, my darling children, you need to know the truth about the day I supposedly died. Because the greatest secret of all is this." Uncle Robert's voice caught in his throat as he read the last lines, his hands shaking so badly that the paper rustled audibly in the silence. Uncle Robert steadied his voice and continued reading, "I never died that day. The car accident was staged to protect all of you. I've been alive these past 15 years, watching over our family from afar, making sure the people who were hunting me never found you." The garden erupted in chaos. The bride's father leaped to his feet, his face a mix of shock and desperate hope. "Robert," he demanded, his voice cracking, "is this true? Have you known all along?" The elderly man nodded slowly, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. She's been living in a small town in Switzerland, Uncle Robert explained, lowering the letter. Running a small bookshop under a different name. The monthly transactions on the 23rd weren't just about remembering her, they were payments to maintain her cover, to keep her security in place. But someone. He looked pointedly at the younger sister. Someone's reckless actions with the company's money started drawing attention to those payments. The younger sister collapsed into sobs, understanding now the full weight of what her gambling addiction and embezzlement had done. "I didn't know," she whispered repeatedly, "I didn't know I was putting Mom in danger." The bride stood up, her wedding dress catching the late afternoon light. "The investigator I hired," she said slowly, "he mentioned something about unusual payments to a bookshop in Switzerland, but I was so focused on exposing the groom's secret family that I never followed up on it." The woman in navy blue stepped forward, still holding her children's hands. "So all of this, the blackmail, the secrets, the double life, it all circles back to protecting your mother?" she asked, looking at the bride's family with new understanding. Before anyone could respond, a commotion arose at the garden entrance. 2 police officers appeared, followed by a figure that made everyone freeze. A woman in her 60s, her silver-streaked hair elegantly styled, walked down the aisle where her daughter should have been walking as a bride. Despite the years, despite the changes, there was no mistaking who she was. "Mom," both sisters whispered in unison, their voices barely audible. The woman smiled gently, tears in her eyes. "When Uncle Robert alerted me about the suspicious transactions, I knew I had to come back. I couldn't watch my family tear itself apart anymore." She looked at her younger daughter with a mix of sadness and compassion. "The people who were hunting me are long gone now. I've been working with international authorities for years to make sure of that. I stayed away to protect you, but I realize now that my absence may have caused more harm than good." The bride's father moved forward on shaking legs, reaching out to touch his wife's face, as if to make sure she was real. The guests watched in stunned silence as 15 years of grief and separation dissolved in a single touch. The police officers stood respectfully to the side, understanding that arrests and legal consequences could wait a few more moments. The younger sister's crimes would have to be addressed, but right now, time seemed to stand still as a family fractured by secrets began to heal. The young boy who had started it all by exposing the groom's secret family tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Is this like those movies where everyone gets a happy ending?" he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His innocent question brought tearful smiles to several faces, but the reality was more complicated. The mother turned to address everyone gathered in the garden, her voice strong despite her emotions. "There's more you all need to know," she said, reaching into her bag to pull out a file. "What happened 15 years ago, and what's happening now, they're connected in ways that none of you could have imagined. And it's time you learned the whole truth." The mother opened the file, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. 15 years ago, I wasn't just testifying against financial fraud. I uncovered a network of corrupt business leaders who were using legitimate companies like ours to hide their illegal operations. One of those companies belonged to the groom's father. The groom stumbled backward, caught off guard by this connection to his own past. His mother gasped, "But my husband died in a boating accident 12 years ago." The mother nodded gravely, "That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Just like my car accident, his death was staged, but for very different reasons." She pulled out a photograph from the file, showing 2 men in business suits shaking hands. One was clearly the groom's father, looking much younger. The other was a familiar face that made the bride's father sink back into his chair. That's our biggest investor," he whispered. "Exactly," the mother continued. "He's been watching our family for years, waiting for the perfect moment to take control of both companies. He knew about the groom's secret family because he helped orchestrate it. He needed leverage, a way to control both bloodlines of his former partner." The woman in navy blue covered her mouth in shock. "The man who introduced me to you," she said to the groom, at that business conference 5 years ago, it wasn't a coincidence, was it? The groom shook his head slowly, pieces of his own past finally falling into place. Your gambling debts, the mother said, turning to her younger daughter, they weren't just bad luck. You were deliberately drawn into high-stakes games, pressured to keep playing, to keep losing. They needed you desperate enough to do anything, even betray your own family. The younger sister's face crumpled as she remembered the mysterious men who had first invited her to those private poker games, who had been so understanding about her mounting debts, who had suggested ways she could borrow from the company accounts. Uncle Robert stepped forward, adding his own piece to the puzzle. The investor has been buying up shares through shell companies, waiting for the perfect scandal to devalue the stock. This wedding, the public exposure of the groom's secret family, it was meant to be the final blow. But they didn't count on one thing. The boy who had started it all looked up. What didn't they count on? He asked, completely engrossed in the story unfolding before him. The mother smiled gently at him. They didn't count on the innocence of a child speaking the truth. They wanted this exposure to happen through leaked documents, through scandal sheets, through whispered rumors. Instead, you brought it into the light. The police officers exchanged glances, one of them speaking into his radio. More sirens could be heard in the distance. We've been building a case for months, one officer explained. Mrs. Thompson's return from Switzerland wasn't just about family, she's been working with international authorities to finally bring down the entire network. The mother turned to the bride, who was still trying to process everything. I know this isn't the wedding day you imagined, she said softly. But your investigation into the groom's secret family helped us gather the final pieces of evidence we needed. And the groom? She looked at him with sympathy. He was as much a victim in this as anyone. The bride looked at her would-be husband with new understanding, seeing now how they had all been pawns in a much larger game. But before anyone could speak, a commotion erupted at the garden entrance. Several men in dark suits were pushing their way through, led by the very investor they had just been discussing. The mother straightened her spine, years of hidden strength showing in her posture. Right on time, she whispered, reaching into her bag one final time. And now, for the final act of this very long play. The investor strode down the aisle, his expensive suit immaculate, his smile confident despite the police presence. What a touching family reunion, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Though I must say, you're all ruining a perfectly orchestrated plan. Behind him, his men spread out through the garden, making some guests nervous enough to start leaving their seats. But the mother's smile only grew wider. You still think you're in control, don't you? She pulled out her phone and pressed a single button. Suddenly, the garden speakers, originally intended for wedding music, crackled to life, and the investor's own voice filled the air, detailed recordings of him planning the entire scheme, from manipulating the younger sister's gambling debts to orchestrating the groom's complicated double life. The investor's confident smile faltered as police officers emerged from among the wedding guests. They had been posed as caterers, photographers, and event staff. We've been recording your conversations for months, the mother revealed. Every meeting, every threat, every plan you made to destroy both our families and take over our companies. The young boy watched wide-eyed as the investor and his men were quickly surrounded. My mom always said the truth sets you free, he said loudly, causing several people to laugh despite the tension. The woman in navy blue hugged him close, finally understanding that her own family's complicated story had been part of something much bigger. The bride stood up, squaring her shoulders. So what happens now? She asked, looking between her mother, the groom, and their gathered families. Her wedding dress caught the last rays of the setting sun, a reminder of how this day had started versus how it was ending. The mother reached out, taking her daughter's hand. Now, we rebuild. Both families, together. She turned to the groom. You're free now, free to choose your own path, to be honest about who you are and what you want. The groom looked between the bride and the woman in navy blue, understanding that while the manipulation was over, the complicated emotions and relationships were still very real. The younger sister stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "I'll turn myself in," she said quietly. "Face the consequences of what I've done." But her mother shook her head. "You've already been punished enough. The authorities have agreed, in exchange for your testimony about how they manipulated you, you'll enter a rehabilitation program instead of serving time." Uncle Robert began gathering the scattered documents, a lifetime of secrets finally seeing the light. The bride's father couldn't take his eyes off his wife, 15 years of grief and loneliness melting away with each passing moment. "We have a lot of catching up to do," he whispered to her. As the police led the investor and his men away, the wedding planner surprisingly stepped forward. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. But I've also never seen so much love, truth, and redemption in one place." The bride looked around at her gathered family, not just her blood relatives, but the woman in navy blue and her children, who had been unwitting players in this drama. "Maybe," she said slowly, "we can still have a celebration today. Not a wedding, but a reunion. A new beginning for all of us." The mother smiled, tears in her eyes. "I've missed too many family dinners," she said. "I think that's a wonderful idea." The young boy who had started it all by shouting at the wedding tugged at the bride's dress. "Does this mean I get to stay for cake?" he asked hopefully, bringing genuine laughter from everyone for the first time that day. As the sun set over the garden, the flowers that had been meant for a wedding now witnessed something far more meaningful: two families, broken by secrets and lies, beginning the process of healing together. The string quartet, sensing the moment, began to play softly, not a wedding march, but a gentle melody of hope and new beginnings. The mother looked at her gathered loved ones and smiled. "Sometimes," she said, "the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all. They're about family, truth, and the courage to begin again." And in that moment, surrounded by the people they loved, everyone knew that while this wedding day hadn't gone as planned, it had ended exactly as it should.